Sean Carroll refuted the fine-tuning argument. This is the first of a 5-part series in which Dr. Luke Barnes and I, Alan Hainline, discuss some of the critiques that Sean Carroll mentioned in the Greer Herd Forum about 5 years ago in response to fine-tuning as evidence for God. We have Dr. Luke Barnes in town for a book launch party. We check out our other podcast on that we'll link to. But while he was here, I also wanted to get his thoughts on what I think is probably the best critique of fine-tuning out there, at least fine-tuning as some kind of evidence for God. Mm-hmm. And that would be by Sean Carroll. Many people cite that video from there was a debate held at, I think it was New Orleans Baptist a few years back, 4 or 5 years back. And it involved, I think, 3 people from each side. But we want to focus more on what was said about fine-tuning. I think Sean Carroll, being an expert physicist from Caltech, he did have some things that he raised that are very, very worthy of response. He is, I think, also, I'm sort of a fan of his. I like to read his blog sometimes and look at what he has to say. Yeah. Even though I have a different worldview, he's obviously way more knowledgeable than I am, and he also is more philosophically astute than some other skeptics or anti-theists.
Yeah, so his main book on naturalism is called The Big Picture, I think. And when I was reading through it, I assume you've read.
I haven't read it. Okay. I've read some of his blogs. Which summarizes it, but
yeah. So he sort of collected a lot of those into the book, and reading through, it's you get the feeling I need to grapple with this. Whereas reading a certain other cosmologists and physicists on this thing, you just think you haven't really engaged with what I actually believe. But Sean's, I mean, it's a very good book. It's very you really feel like he understands the critique, so he's aiming them well. And if you want to sort of hold off, you better have a good defense of this thing. So. I appreciate his work a lot.
Absolutely, yeah. So he has 5 main points that he raised against fine-tuning, and so I'd kind of like to get your thoughts on how would you respond to these? Are these defeaters for a fine-tuning argument, things like that? So his first point was, we really don't know that the universe is tuned specifically for life, since we don't know the conditions under which life is possible. Biologists can't seem to agree on an exact definition of life.
Right.
So how then can you say the universe is finely tuned for life?
Yeah, so the objection here is we want to say, if the universe had been some other way, then life wouldn't have formed in that universe. And if we want to make that claim, how are we going to do that if we don't know what life is, if these biologists don't know? And I think the answer to that is really, like our bar is so low, you just set it really conservatively low. So, for example, if you make the cosmological constant, there's this number that describes how the expansion of the universe accelerates. Let's make it a trillion times larger. Okay, then instead of our universe, which is forming structure via gravity over the history of 13.8 billion years. Instead, you have a universe which starts off very smooth and then just rapidly accelerates, and so everything is just driven away from everything else. And the formation of structure, this coming together of the stuff in our universe, it would stop after. I've got to remember what numbers I use now. Less than a year. And so on that time scale, the universe is just completely smooth. And so you end up with a universe which is just one proton every, couple of miles. And they never come across each other, and they're just being driven apart.
And over time, it's accelerating further and further
and it just
apart.
gets worse.
Yeah.
And so in those circumstances, we don't know what life is, but it's not that. It's not just one proton every, billion light years or something, so there are uncertainties there, and I think you've got to be quite careful with them. But I think we can, in particular, you don't want to just sort of project our form of life onto what life could possibly be. But I think there are certain very clear-cut
several clear-cut cases that are so improbable that it's hard to view this as a defeater. Well, I think in order for him to show that no life is possible, I would want to see interaction with all the physics articles out there that claim fine-tuning and show why maybe this is wrong or
Yeah.
I think that's really the kind of thing we would need to see as a defeater personally.
Yeah.
But
And especially in terms of if we have these clear-cut cases, if you want to say there's life in that universe, I think you kind of owe us more than hey, maybe it's possible. Like, you owe us a definite, description of what actually do you think in that universe is going to count as life. Because they're so simple, we can characterize them pretty completely. Like, we know what's going on in there because they're so simple. They're so much simpler than our universe.
yeah, exactly. It's amazing, actually, how well cosmologists can predict what was happening at the early universe. I was having a conversation with my daughter this weekend, and she was like, how do they know all this stuff? It's because when things are operating that simply, you just have to know nuclear physics, and you can predict the element, the relative proportions of elements and so forth.
Yeah, so when we do a prediction of, say, what nuclear reactions happen in the first couple of minutes, there's a reasonably complicated set of reactions that are happening, but we can churn through those. I mean, it's called Alter BBN if you want to look it up. There's codes available online. You could download them on your little laptop there, hit go, and probably in a couple of seconds, maybe a couple of minutes, it'll have totally predicted all the elemental abundances for the first 3 minutes of the universe and just totally nailed them, and we get most of those right. By contrast, if you want to predict the universe is like today, even on the larger scale of galaxies, we do these supercomputer simulations, and for those you've got much larger, more complicated codes. You've got to bring in gravity and the expansion of the universe and gas physics and how gas cools and how stars form and how supernovae feedback. And in a lot of these cases, you sort of got to fudge these in by hand a little bit. And then the biggest ones that are around today, you need sort of 5,000 computers linked together to chug away for a month and a half to get those going, or even larger than that. You're talking 500 years of collective sort of computer time, and even then we're sort of, they kind of work, and we're still so.
But your point is you need fine-tuning to have the kind of complexity that makes it difficult to model. Many of these ways, if they weren't fine-tuned, it would be so simple, we can be reasonably confident. Even with people, most of the physicists writing articles about the fine-tuning, they have very generous expectations of what evolution could do once it got started, or whether it could even get started.
Yeah. So in particular, there is a little bit of a focus on carbon, for example, but I think that's justified in certain circumstances. I mean, a lot of the fine-tuning cases don't even assume that. You just need some sort of complexity.
Like cosmological constant.
But even if you focus on carbon, I mean, we know the periodic table of elements. And so you can ask things like, okay, what element forms the most compounds? And it's carbon by light years. It's just so far ahead of everything else. So, we did a comparison in the book where you say, all right, let's just take hydrogen and one other compound. And if it's, hydrogen and nitrogen, you get some, tens of chemical compounds, and that's the sort of average number if it's oxygen. If you take hydrogen and carbon, you can make, tens of thousands of different compounds. So, I think we understand enough about the conditions of complexity, and these arguments are so conservative and generous, and we just want to see any structure at all. That basically, if you want to make this argument, you need more than skepticism. You need a specific, fine-tuning, busting simple form of life that's going to turn up in any old universe. You can't just appeal to a possibility. Tell us what it is, because these universes are simple. It should be simple to tell us what that form of life is.
That's a good point. And just one more note on silicon that I know you've talked about before is the fact that you have to go through carbon to get to silicon in stellar fusion because it's a heavier element. And so most universes that have silicon would also have carbon, and so it doesn't do a whole lot to the relative proportion.
Yeah, because we're just interested in the sort of basics. Can we make these? Do they stick together?
Yeah.
It doesn't make much of a difference.